Let me ask you about the question of what influence the U.S. really does have on Israeli behavior. There's been so many times when the Israelis basically humiliated the White House, seemingly deliberately. Many times the Americans said that the Israelis had agreed to a ceasefire with Hamas, and then Netanyahu or his allies come out and say we would never agree to a ceasefire of that kind. Just recently, the Biden administration basically said that it had brokered a 21-day pause between fighting with Israel and Hezbollah, and it was the next day that Netanyahu ordered the killing of Nasrallah and the further bombing of Beirut, making the United States look, I mean, just completely hapless and impotent. So at this point, after so many times when Biden declared a red line, saying that it was a red line for him for Israel to invade Rafah, which was the only safe place for refugees, and Netanyahu not only did it anyway, but made clear that he doesn't care about Biden's red lines. At this point, even though it would be terrible for the U.S. to have Israel attack their oil refineries in Iran or their nuclear facilities, does the U.S. really have any leverage or power at this point at all, especially right before an election where they don't want to be seen to be impeding Israel?
Well, Glenn, as you know well, we have the leverage. The question is, will we use it? And I don't think so. I mean, many, many times over the past few years after writing the lobby book, I've said, this time we've had enough, I'm sure, and we're going to use that leverage and force the Israelis to change their behavior. And I've been wrong every time. I cannot think of one case where we used our leverage to get Israel to change its behavior on a key issue. The Israelis just thumb their nose at us. And this is especially true of Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, whatever you think of Benjamin Netanyahu, he is a brilliant politician. I really am amazed at how good he is at manipulating public opinion in Congress and in the United States more generally. He's very skillful. And you put him up against Joe Biden, and you have the sense that it's Bambi versus Godzilla. And given the power of the lobby and given Netanyahu's political skills and Joe Biden's situation as a lame duck, who I'm sure is not firing on all cylinders, I find it hard to imagine. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this will be the first time where I'm wrong. But I don't think.
No, even really if you listen to the State Department briefings, where Matthew Miller is saying, we would like the Israelis not to do this, but at the end of the day, it's their choice. We can't dictate to them. But in this case, I just want to kind of put this in the proper expression of what it really means, is that it seems like the Democrats who are running the executive branch, whoever that might be, are so captive to Israel, so fearful of using that leverage that you just described, that of course they have, that they're willing to risk some sort of potential global recession or oil crisis in the United States, where people have long lines for oil, for gasoline, or the oil prices are skyrocketing, or even willing to risk their own chances in this election in 38 days, if the alternative means having to stand up to the Israelis. I mean, that's how extreme it seems to me to be. Is that the way you see it as well?
Yes, I think you described it very well. I mean, I have nothing to add to what you said.
It's so alarming to watch this happen. While I have you here, and I've asked you this before, and you have often said, whenever I've asked you, I've seen you say it other places as well, that if anything, what you described about the Israel lobby and the power of it in the 2006 or 2007 book, I always forget which year it was. 2006, was it?
2007 book, right?
Yeah, 2007. That if anything, the power is certainly the same, but probably even greater. As you know, though, the one of the most, I guess, formidable arguments against that view is that the reason the United States doesn't use leverage against the Israelis is because we're perfectly happy with the Israelis doing what they're doing, kind of eliminating its enemies, going after Iran, who the United States considers to be a main adversary in the Middle East, and the way it's trying to align itself with Saudi Arabia and sort of create an alliance between the Persian Gulf states and Israel. Is there any truth to that, do you think, that it's not necessarily the Israelis controlling the United States, but more the United States trying to create the appearance that they're opposed to what the Israelis are doing, but in reality are perfectly fine with it?
No, I think that argument is wrong. And let me just sort of lay out why I think that's the case. But before I do that, let me just point out that that is the main alternative argument to the argument that Steve and I lay out in the book. First of all, with any two countries, and here we're talking about the United States and Israel, of course, there are going to be situations where they have common interests. And the United States is going to support Israel and be happy to see Israel do its dirty work, so to speak. This was especially true during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were competing with each other in the Middle East. And Israel was occasionally an important ally for the United States. We had common interests. But there are also going to be many cases where two countries have different or competing or conflicting interests. And what happens in those cases tell you whether I'm right and Steve is right, or whether the alternative view is right. And I would argue that if you look at all of the cases, or almost all of the cases, where the United States is pushing in one direction and the Israelis are pushing in the other direction, the Israelis win in almost every case. And when you look at the process, you do what we call in the social sciences process tracing. You look at how the decision was made. You see that the lobby and Israel itself weighed in big time in the American decision-making process and got its way, or got their way. And that supports the argument that Steve and I lay out. So I think if you look at the empirical evidence carefully, we are right, and the other side in this debate is wrong.
We sent a reporter, Michael Tracy, to the spin room, that place where all the surrogates go after the debates. The vice presidential debate was this week, and he was able to interview a whole bunch of different people in Congress. And one of the people he interviewed was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who's a very young, I think she's in her early 30s, black woman from a very blue district in Texas. She's kind of made a name for herself by being very vitriolic in her opposition to Trump, so she's perceived and often described as sort of this leftist, almost squad-like member. And when Michael used his opportunity to interview her, he asked her about not just Israel, but also her repeated votes to fund the war in Israel. And she sounded like Marco Rubio or Lindsey Graham talking about how the Israelis are the victimized party. And she said that she had gone on a trip to Israel. And part of it is just almost every member of Congress goes on those trips to Israel where they're all kind of educated by the Israelis about the situation. But then also they looked this year where AIPAC succeeded in doing the hardest thing there is to do in American politics, which is removing incumbent members of Congress from their jobs by pouring millions of dollars into the primaries of two Israel critics, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. And so do you think that whatever members of Congress are more willing to be critical of Israel, that is a very effective way to keep them in line, to intimidate them, to say, look what we do to people who step out of line, and if you want to keep your job, you better sound exactly like Jasmine Crockett sounded when she talked to Michael last night or on Tuesday night?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You started off by saying that these people argue that they've been educated, and the gist of this line of argument is that they've come to see the light. There is a really serious intellectual case for supporting Israel, and that's why they're doing it. This is hogwash, right? This is not why they're supporting Israel, hook, line, and sinker. It's because of the lobby. They saw what happened to Bowman and Bush, and they don't want it to happen to them. So if you look at the Black Caucus inside the House, for example, you'll see that almost all of those people support Israel down the line.
Vehemently, not even paying lip service to, at least the White House will say, Israel, too many people have died in Gaza, the Israelis we always encouraging them to be, not even that, not even a willingness to include that standard rhetoric about, it's unfortunate how many civilians are dying, just all out defense of Israel from the places that you would think would be the least likely to offer that.
Absolutely.
It's really remarkable. Yeah. Let me ask you about the election, because obviously the Israelis know that what they're doing is taking place in the context of an election in the United States that is rapidly approaching. And while the Democrats are certainly no models of standing up to Israel and putting restraints on them, to put that mildly, if you look at the Trump campaign and the people he's most surrounded by, most closely surrounded by, but also who's financing his campaign, particularly Miriam Adelson, who's giving him $100 million. And she, of course, is the widow of Sheldon Adelson, who is a multi-billionaire who has always made clear that he funds American politics to keep everybody in line with Israel. He had bought newspapers in Israel that were the most hardline ones as well. And you listen to how much Trump is saying that we're going to make Israel great again, we're going to do everything for Israel. Is there, do you think, as part of the motive of what the Israelis are doing, any kind of an attempt to affect the 2024 election in a way that would help Donald Trump win?
I think that's a possibility. It's very hard to tell with what Netanyahu's motives are, but you can make a case that he's probably interested in doing everything he can to help Donald Trump. And the way you do that is you just create havoc in the Middle East. And that allows Trump to say, when I was president, there was hardly any havoc in the Middle East. And in fact, I did not start any wars. I'm not a warmonger. And if the Democrats are in power, because they're weak and because they're idiotic, what you get are wars here, there, and everywhere. So reelect me. That would be the message. And this is why I think if a major conflagration breaks out, let's assume one breaks out and the whole oil issue doesn't come into play. So there's no real economic threat here. But what we see is just war in the Middle East, a widening war. The American people are going to say this is not good. And this happened on the Democrats' watch. And Trump will make hay of that. And he'll say that, I'm not interested in fighting wars. I'm not a warmonger. Reelect me. And I think that will be an effective argument.
Well, let me ask you about the argument, not politically, but substantively. Whatever else you think about Trump, it actually is true that he was the first American president in decades not to involve the United States in a new war. He inherited the bombing campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria and did what he said he would do, which was escalate that bombing until it ended. But it is the case that a lot of wars have broken out in the last 4 years under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris that did not break out when Trump was president, including for all the talk about how he was a Russian agent willing to hand the Russians everything. The Russians invaded Ukraine, not under Trump, but under Joe Biden, and it's a war that has continued to this day. Is that a coincidence? Or I think Trump's theory is, because I talk so tough, because I make clear that I'll destroy people if they mess with the United States, and it's kind of this Reagan-esque peace through strength, that it deters people, and it's weakness that's provocative. Do you think there's a truth to that version that Trump is offering, that argument that he's making?
I think there's some truth to it. Let's just talk about first the Ukraine war and then talk about the Middle East. I think if Trump had been president, he had been reelected in the 2020 election, that we would not have had the Ukraine war. It's clear to me that the Russians were very interested in avoiding a war, and then once the war started, shutting it down. And at the same time, I believe that Biden had no interest in accommodating the Russians. He had no interest in working out a diplomatic solution. And I believe that he bears a huge amount of responsibility for this war. I think that Biden's basic instincts are those of a warmonger. And I think that's not true of Trump. I think Trump is not that interested in fighting wars. And I think in the case of Ukraine, I can't prove this. We can't run the counterfactual. But I think if Trump had been president, we would not have had a war in Ukraine. The Middle East, what happened on October 7th, that's a different issue. I think if Trump had been president, October 7th would have happened anyway. Because Trump, as you pointed out, wouldn't have behaved any differently towards Israel than the Democrats did. The interesting question is what Trump would have done after October 7th. I've often thought that there is no other president who we have had in the past who would have been as accommodating to the Israelis as Joe Biden has been since October 7th. I just have the sense that George W. Bush and Barack Obama, just to take two cases, even Bill Clinton, would have put their foot down at some point along the way. They would have tried to get tough with the Israelis. And of course, Biden hasn't done that at all. So the question is, what do you think Trump would have done if he had been president? And to be honest, Glenn, I don't have a good answer to that. I think that he might have put his foot down, but I'm not 100% sure. So I think on the sort of Middle East, I don't see a lot of difference as to whether you had Biden or Trump in the White House. But I think with regard to Ukraine, it did matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, the Democrats are going to endorse and support and pursue every war because they've been doing that for quite a long time. It's sort of this ingrained philosophy in the Democratic Party now that that's a positive way the United States affects the world. Whereas Trump may do the same thing in certain cases, but he's also a big question mark. So there's at least some unpredictability there. And he even has been critical of Israel and Netanyahu on several occasions for doing things like stupidly posting to social media, soldiers in Gaza, celebrating gratuitous violence and ransacking homes and kind of being critical of Netanyahu in other ways. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.